Fidel Castro said that for every one person executed in Cuba, 1,000 men, women, and children had been killed by American bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 14 years earlier. Cuba had just successfully overthrown the brutal, murderous, undemocratic, US-backed Batista military dictatorship. Batista's men had tortured and murdered countless peasants before and during Cuba's revolution. These men were horrific war criminals, and the new revolutionary government was fearing an outpouring of popular revenge against them. So the government set up revolutionary tribunals to try former Batista officials. For each trial, juries composed of rebel army veterans and members of the local community. They heard testimony of witnesses before the public. Mothers confronted the killers of their sons, children accused the murderers of their fathers. Sometimes, former soldiers in Batista's army detailed the criminal actions of their superiors. In many cases, the person standing trial confessed. The press were present at some of the first executions in Santiago, and when photos and videos made their way to the US, they were largely misinterpreted. A Bohemia survey showed that over 90% of Cubans supported the revolutionary government at this time, with revolutionary justice being the most popular thing the government was doing. To prove this, Fidel Castro invited a delegation of reporters and government officials from Canada, Latin America, Great Britain, and the United States to witness the trials for themselves. And the US Embassy said that over 500,000 Cubans showed up at a rally to support the trials. The Cuban government put this number at 1 million. This is where he made the comment about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He also said the much celebrated Nuremberg trials had condemned people under laws written after the fact, while in Cuba, the accused had violated already existing laws. Finally, he compared the indignation of Cuba's critics in the present with their silence in the past. Where were those critics, he asked, while Batista's regime was killing people? Did they raise their voices to protest then? No. This is only one video, and it's only the story of the executions that happened immediately after the revolution. I hope this story can help show you some of the bias in the narrative we've been fed about Cuba so that you can do your own research and come to your own conclusions, but just know that this bias is not a coincidence. Within the next few years, the Cuban government began to redistribute land from American plantations to the Cuban peasantry. Of course, the US business class did not like this, so they started pressuring the US government to begin its embargo on Cuba. Before I go, I want to point out that Cuba has not executed anybody on the record since 2003, unlike the US, who has continually executed people who are found to be innocent, so...
And large numbers of Cuban soldiers who went to fight in Angola were of African origin. And in fact, Fidel's speech saying why they were going to fight, one, he said it's our internationalist duty, but secondly, he said we owe a debt to Africa, because many of the slaves brought to Cuba were brought from that part of the African continent, and we are going to return now to help them. And that is why one of the first visits Mandela made after he was released, I think the very first, was to Havana, to publicly thank Fidel for sending in the Cuban army. And Mandela said at that talk in Havana, that was the biggest blow against the apartheid system, that they were being defeated by largely black armies. It destroyed their feeling of invincibility, and it was the beginning of the end.
Before we say anything.
Una cosa antes de hablar, nada.
Before we say anything.
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema,
you must tell me when you are coming to South Africa.
Me tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
You say, no, just a moment.
No, un momento.
Es seguro, si ya yo recibí.
The sooner the better.
And our friend Cuba,
y nuestro amigo Cuba,
which helped us in training our people,
que nos ayudó a entrenar a nuestra gente,
gave us resources to get on with our struggle,
que nos ayudaron tanto nuestra
trained
lucha,
our people as doctors and so on.
A nuestros médicos.
You have not come to our country.
Cuba no ha venido a visitarnos, usted no ha ido a visitarnos.
When are you coming?
¿Cuándo viene?
No he visitado a mi patria surafricana.
I haven't visited my South African homeland
La
yet.
quiero como una patria.
I love it as a
Pero
homeland.
Y por el pueblo
I love it as a homeland as I love you and the South African
When are you
people.
coming to South
Pero
Africa?
¿cuándo viene a Sudáfrica?
Creo que va a tener que ser hoy mismo. Va a
I
tener
think it
que
will have to be today. I will have to fly back with you.
No, you are very, very, very
Él se va a las 10.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, Africans. I hope you're faring well where you are. And if you ain't faring well, please fare well where you are. Now, today let's go back into history a little bit so that you can be able to understand the present. Sometimes for us to understand the present, we need to know something about the past. And this is what I always say. We don't need to repeat the past. What we need to do is learn from the past. The past is geopolitically or politically, the past we call history. So let's learn from history and let's not repeat the bad history, okay? Now, what happens is the United States of America has always had an influence, an interest in meddling into the affairs of other nations. This one is commonly seen in many third world countries. In Africa is a good example. The DRC, we had Ghana, we had Libya is even a more perfect example. In the Caribbean, we also have some of these countries. And a better example to illustrate what I have to tell you today is the country of Cuba, a country that was led by a man, a legend by the name of Fidel Castro. Before Fidel Castro, we had somebody who was called Batista. Batista was somebody who was backed by the United States of America, So before the US took interest in Cuba, we had Spain, and Spain was such a huge thing in the past, The Spanish were actually the first enslavers, not the British or the other people. It was the Spanish and the Portuguese, and these two countries, Spain and Portugal, are neighbors. And Spain is the closest European country to Africa at a place called Morocco. So Spain is the first country to even, to enslave Africans. So they went around colonizing until it reaches a point where it is the point of inevitable point. You can't do nothing beyond it. It has to happen, It is inevitable. Every empire comes to fall. Spain was falling and it was losing some of its, colonies and some of its, the protectorate it had. And one of these protectorates was Cuba. So United States of America decided to help Cuba restore itself and uproot, Spain. But United States of America does not give you nothing for free. Nothing from the devil comes for free. You have to pay for it. And this is a perfect example even with the United States of America. After helping Cuba kick away the Spanish, they themselves became the new enslavers. It's such a huge thing why we have problems in Cuba. And a good example is what I'm about to tell you and why Cuba in itself is always declining. Let's listen to some of these examples and illustrations that are going to tell us more and more about the problem of Cuba. I shall get back. We shall have a deeper critical analysis concerning these videos. Let's dive in.
Now, why did United States of America, why did they hate Cuba? Now, to answer this question, we have to go back before the American-Spanish War, or the Spanish-American War. Now, Spain was an empire, but it was losing its grip over its colonies. Now, the few colonies it has left was Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And these countries, they wanted their independence as well. Now, United States was close to Cuba, and they thought, how can we get involved in this? Should we help these countries fight against Spain to get their independence and become the good, nice big brother? Or should we take this as an opportunity to create our own empire as well? They choose the latter, and which led to the American-Philippines War. But that is a different story. So the United States helped Cuba to kick out Spain. Now, Cuba thought they were free, but the United States said no. Remember, we helped you fight against the Spanish. Cuba said yes, good. So We want to always have influence in your nation, both politically and economically. And also we want Guantanamo Bay as ours. We can take it as indefinite lease to the United States. How about that? Well, Cuba had no choice and they concurred. Now, naturally, as time goes by, you get governments that want to shy away from the United States' influence. And the United States did not like that. So they sponsored, the CIA sponsored a coup in 1952 and brought in a guy called Batista to become the dictator of Cuba. So the E can be doing United States bidding. Now, after a while, a guy called Fidel Castro came with a communist revolution and fought against Batista and chased Batista away, and they set up a communist government in Cuba. Now, United States was not happy about this because they don't like communism, because, you know, USSR, or aka Russia, is a communist state. So they were not happy about that, and they also saw Cuba as their first indirect colonies, you see. So they didn't want to let it go. So what they did, they sanctioned Cuba. They placed an embargo on Cuba. That's why Cuban cigar is a delicacy, because of the embargo. And the embargo wasn't removed until 2011 by Obama. You know, so it took that long. So it affected Cuban economy a lot. So it's not that Cuba had a bad government all this while. It's because of the embargo against Cuba. Now, Fidel Castro said, oh, if you're going to place an embargo against us, we are just going to ask for Guantanamo Bay back. And the United States was like, no. So the United States sponsored the Batista's group to try to fight against Fidel Castro's government, to invade Cuba. But Fidel Castro defeated them. But now Fidel Castro had to do something about it. So he decided to stop United States, we have to be friends with USSR, what we call Russia today. Now, so they asked USSR for help, and they came and placed missiles in Cuba to protect Cuba from United States and, you know, its puppies. Now, United States was not happy about that, and it almost caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. It almost caused nuclear war between United States and USSR. But it was settled that United States should take out all the missiles from Turkey, and USSR would take out their missiles from Cuba, you see. So that is why United States were not very happy with Cuba, and how Cuban economy was destroyed for a very, very long time. Because, you know, United States, they always want to be in control. And whenever they lose control over a country or a so-called puppet, they usually do anything to punish that country and bring them back if possible. So, yeah, that's it.
They are being so mean to Cuba because they also want to force the Cuban failure. Mm-hmm. If it not happen naturally, and it won't, because it happens, socialism happened to work for us, then it has to happen artificially. So sometimes they say, Cuba is blaming the embargo for every failure that they have, but they are their own problem. I say, hey, let's do it differently. If the embargo is our excuse, why won't you remove it? Why to add up and add up and add up every year new measures of extortion and aggression if it's not working? But at the same time, it has a domestic purpose too. They want to demonize, and probably one of the most successful experiences of socialism on earth, that it happens to be Cuba, since we are healthy, we are educated. Cubans finish college without debts. They even can emigrate to the U.S. and start a brand new life with their socialist education. Why did they say that Cuba is in the list also, not just terrorism, but human trafficking? Because they are demonizing one of the most noble and prestigious collaboration system of agreements on air, which is the Cuban international medical collaboration, that it has the respect, the acknowledgement, and the recognition of all countries on air, including international medical organizations and United Nations. But in the case of US, it is a way to say, no, that's not, it couldn't be true that Cubans will go, that we're going to send bombs and we will invade countries and Cuba will send doctors. It cannot be true that in Bolivia and in Brazil, the only people that will go to the indigenous community will be the Cuban doctors. But by lying on this issue, US is committing a crime, because the access to healthcare is a human right. So when you say that Cubans in Bolivia were doing political war instead of saving life, they are condemning millions of people, like they did in Brazil, to go back to a life without having the possibility of seeing a doctor if you're pregnant, or if you have high blood pressure, or if you need a surgery. So that has an impact immediately. But that's in general for Latin America. I mean, neoliberal policies in Latin America that has been.
Actually, I want to ask you about because you kind of go into it.
That's the idea.
I want to ask you about the issue of Latin America. Since you bring it up, there's been all these victories, these left-wing victories.
Perhaps no one felt as pushed out by the Cuban arrivals as brusquely as black Miamians. Little Havana sat across the Miami River from Overtown, the city's historic black neighborhood since the 1890s. Miami belonged to the Jim Crow South, and as African Americans watched Cubans ensconce themselves there, they noted all kinds of contradictions. At a time and place in which racial segregation was rampant, they observed how almost all Cubans, often no matter their skin color, became white. Sometimes it happened at the very moment of arrival. When they registered at the refugee center downtown, people received hotel vouchers if they needed them. Almost all but the very darkest refugees received vouchers for white hotels. Miami beaches were just as segregated. Some were restricted to whites, others to blacks. Quote, "But Cubans may use either beach," reported Look magazine in April 1959. Cuban children, almost no matter their complexion, were allowed to go to white public schools, which were invariably better resourced than their black counterparts. In 1961, a local black minister speculated that African Americans in Miami could solve the problem of school segregation simply by teaching their children to speak only Spanish. Such observations aside, black leaders consistently emphasized that the problem was not with the new arrivals themselves, but with the preferential treatment given them by the government. As the head of Miami's Urban League insisted, "We're not angry at the Cubans, but at a system that will do more for outsiders than for its own citizens." The Cubans, however, were not just any outsiders. They were outsiders fleeing communism at the height of the Cold War, and that made refugees an asset. They might be willing recruits for Washington's anti-Castro projects. At the very least, their arrival in large numbers helped tarnish the image of the revolution before the world. Accordingly, the Immigration and Naturalization Service gave Cubans temporary legal status. Then, near the end of his term, Eisenhower established a Cuban Refugee Emergency Center to coordinate relief to Cuban arrivals. The program, renamed and expanded by Kennedy, gave Cubans access to all kinds of resources: work permits, job training, English classes, small loans, subsidized childcare, housing assistance, and job referrals. Access to those benefits allowed Cubans to work for lower wages than others, sometimes for as little as half the wage garnered by their black counterparts. One report estimated that between 1959 and 1962, 12,000 African Americans lost their jobs to Cubans. Sometimes it was the US government itself that was giving Cubans employment. In the early 1960s, the CIA had 12,000 Cubans on its payroll, making it one of the largest employers of the state of Florida. In fact, the CIA's largest station in the world outside of its headquarters in Langley, Virginia, was located in Miami. The agency also controlled more than 50 front businesses, a large number of them in Little Havana. They were CIA-owned, Cuban exile-run travel agencies, gun shops, real estate offices, and the like. Such ventures, quote, helped exiles hone their entrepreneurial skills and boosted them economically, though they did little to topple Castro. It was assistance from the US government that made the early...
You know, there's a saying that if you sleep with the goat, you must catch lice. Lice is an insect. Some of you might not know lice because you've never been in a position to interact with it. I pray that you never interact with it. It's a blood-sucking, tiny, tiny, tiny parasite or an insect, if you like. It sucks you a lot, and it loves goats, you know. Your skin is different from the skin of a goat. A goat can thrive it, but you as a human, it's hard. But if you sleep with a goat or close to a goat, you will catch that lice, you know. Any country, I'm speaking symbolically, and any country that interacts with the United States of America, for example, United States of America represents the goat, you know, and the lice is now the consequences, you know, the consequences of the interaction between a country and the United States of America. DRC interacted with the US. Look at where DRC is right now. DRC is collapsing. DRC is, it's not such a good place to be, you know. It's not such a good place to thrive as a human. It's not a good place for children to grow. Look at Libya. Libya has fallen. We were sold a fake propaganda that that man who was there, Muammar Gaddafi, was a man of chaos, was a man of violence, was a man who did not want the growth and peace of his people. But after the US took him out, what was left of Libya? You see for yourself. Libya was a country that was going to become a prime factor to the growth of Africa. And so the growth of Africa was threatening the West. So the USA came in and did their thing. These are better examples and good examples. But let's go back to our story of Cuba. Cuba itself, I really love that country. But if you go to that country of Cuba, they are communists. It is a communist country. And remember, communism was an economic ideology that was being pushed by the United States of America. That is capitalism, sorry. But communism now was an economic ideology that was being pushed by the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic. You know, it was a union of a various number of countries in Eastern Europe. Today, what's left of USSR is Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine does not include itself as part of the USSR, but now we have Russia as the huge part, you know. So they were pushing communism. Spain in itself was a colonizer back then. They failed and they were losing their people. They were losing their protectorate, not people. And they were losing their colonies, you know. And now United States of America, which was now an empire becoming, decided to help those countries which were members of the Spanish protectorates to free themselves. But they were freeing themselves out of the Spanish colonial powers into the American neo-colonial powers. And I'm telling you, neo-colonialism is very much dangerous than colonialism in itself. You know, neo-colonialism is colonialism that is permitted by the world. They go behind the laws and they maneuver the laws and the books to make it legal for them to act on other countries' social, economic, and political affairs. You know, here in Kenya, a good example is we have the Constitution, as a good example, does not allow the military deals to be processed in the parliament. So they are not vetted in the parliament. They are passed as laws. They are passed as laws. What is needed is just the signature of the president. That is how much they've made themselves. An American soldier or a foreigner has more freedom in Africa than an African. Yes, it's true. In fact, those soldiers have more immunity than you, who is an African in Africa. But you go to where they live, you as a black person, you go there, just a normal white person or a normal anybody, it's not the same. You are a substandard citizen over there. But Africa, we have the spirit of Ubuntu. Cuba has African roots as well. They have the spirit of Ubuntu. They welcomed the help that was coming from US only to be lied to. You know, the US lied to them that we will make things easier for you, we'll do this and that, but they never did. What they wanted is to have strategic locations in Cuba and find a way that they would be able to, you know, reach other countries such as Mexico, other countries in Central America, and other countries in the Caribbean. I believe that from the history of Cuba, we can be able to learn the strategies and the evil ways of the neo-colonizer, how he operates and how he does his ways. Right now, we are clever enough to know and to understand the same old trick. Yes. Guys, Cuba in itself is a prime example of one of those countries that were very much there to help in the liberation of Africa. South Africa, for instance. Cuba assisted South Africa in the liberation of itself to independence. Cuba was there until Nelson Mandela became the president in 1994. It helped the rebels in South Africa to fight against the apartheid regime. Cuba was always there with Fidel Castro. You know, anytime a strong man stands up and fights for the rights of people and fights for the rights of his own people, I mean in this instance, not just any people, his own people, he automatically becomes an enemy of the USA because the US is not there for the people, it's there for the resources. The resources is there for the people, not for the US government. Now you understand the conflict? Yep, I know you better understand the conflict. But now I'm looking back and I'm thinking, we know and we understand their strategy. It's high time we act smart and we act better as black people, as Cubans also, as the whole world. Let's live in harmony, let's live in unity, and let's live in peace. This video is for educational purposes only. Thanks for watching. This is EFK Original Documentaries. See you in the next one.